Hello, guys. Tonight we begin with a world bathed in sun and sprinkled with olive oil from ancient Greece, a civilization known for philosophy, democracy, and statues that did not believe in pants. But under the legends of Plato, Sparta, and the Golden Temples, a much harder truth hides. Because, although ancient Greece gave us the roots of Western civilization, it also gave its average citizen a daily struggle that would be hard to survive today. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to give a like to the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you follow us from and what time it is there. It is always fascinating to see who joins us from different parts of the world. Now, dim the lights, turn on a fan to create a soft background murmur, and delve with me into tonight's journey. Welcome to ancient Greece, where the day does not begin with the sound of the alarm clock, but with the sun turning your house into a slow-cooking oven. Your home is modest, built with sun-dried mud bricks or rough stone, with small windows without glass, only wooden shutters to keep out the goats, and perhaps some breeze if the gods are generous. There is no insulation, no ceiling fan, and of course there is no personal space either, unless you count the corner where the family goat doesn't sleep. You get up early, not because you are disciplined, but because it is already too hot to stay lying down. In summer, the stone walls absorb heat like a sponge. And at dawn, your little house radiates that heat toward your bones. In winter, those same walls become a freezer, and you basically wrap yourself in a sheet, hoping not to become a frozen statue. You probably slept on a thin mat or a straw-filled mattress. No pillows, just a rolled-up layer or maybe your arm. If you were lucky, the lice left you alone last night. But probably not. There is no running water. So your morning routine consists of going to the public fountain, or, if you live in the countryside, carrying water from a nearby well. You transport it in clay jugs that you balance on your shoulders while you pray in silence, not to stumble and break the back pain of an entire week on the ground. To groom yourself, you don't bathe in the morning. That is reserved for the end of the day, if it's done. Maybe you wash your face, rub a little olive oil on your skin, and then remove it with a strigil, a curved metal blade. Think of it as a spa day, but without the spa, the day, or any real effect, and don't even think about privacy. Your family lives in the same room. You sleep together, you eat together, and you argue about who has brought mud in from the street. Because the street is also your hallway, your source of news, and your landfill. You haven't eaten yet, and your back already hurts. You are sweating, and your tunic sticks to you in places where it shouldn't. And this is the best part of your day. You have survived the oven that is a Greek bedroom. It's time to recharge, right? Welcome to breakfast in ancient Greece. A meal so scarce that it makes modern intermittent fasting look like a feast. Your first bite of the day. Barley bread. Broken, hard, and as appetizing as the earth near where it was baked. It's called maza. It is made with ground barley mixed with water, shaped into flat cakes, and left to bake on hot stones or in the ashes of the previous night's fire. Think of an ancient cereal bar, but without sweetness, texture, or joy. You can dip it in watered wine because, surprise, water is not always drinkable. There is no filtration system, no kettles, no clay jugs in your pantry. So, instead, everyone from children to the elderly takes a cup of wine mixed with water. Not for the high, but to survive. If you are rich, you may get a fig or two, some olives, or some goat cheese. But let's be honest, you're not rich. You are lucky if the bread is not full of flies from the day before, and you do not break a tooth when biting it. There is no coffee, no eggs, no fruit bowl, no honey, unless you live near a decent beekeeper and know how to bribe them. And don't expect to sit down and relax. The meals are quick. There are no chairs, nor forks, and, of course, no eating with attention. You chew nod, then go back to work. And if you are a woman, you don't even eat with the men. In many homes, women and children eat separately, often after the men finish. So, not only is the food bad, but you also have to wait to take your turn at disappointment. The irony: the ancient Greeks are the same ones who gave us symposiums, banquets, and poetic odes to wine. But breakfast does not deserve even a line of verse. It is utilitarian, dry, often literally burned, and yet you chew it like a champion because it is the only thing that stands between you and a full day of sun, work, and philosophical discussions. Enjoy your meal. Try not to break a tooth. Now that you have swallowed your brick of stale barley and a splash of water with wine, it is time to cool off. Or more exactly, not to do so, because in ancient Greece, hygiene had not so much to do with cleanliness as with ritual and oil, and soap was a fantasy reserved for future centuries. The morning bath usually consisted of pouring cold water over the body in a public fountain or in the patio sink. Unless you are lucky enough to live near a bathhouse, which is not the case for most, there is no shampoo, no mint scented shower gel, no sponges, unless you have stolen one from a sponge diver in the Ion. Instead, olive oil is used. Yes, oil. It is rubbed on the skin, not to hydrate it, but to collect dirt and sweat. Then you remove it with a strigil, a curved bronze blade that leave you less greasy, but still a little dubious. Imagine smearing sauce and then shaving. That's your skincare routine. And if you think that sounds glamorous, remember that everyone else does too, often in community settings, naked and making a lot of noise. Hygiene is social in ancient Greece. Privacy is not. Now let's talk about teeth. There are no toothbrushes or toothpaste. Maybe you rub your gums with crushed charcoal or rinse with vinegar if you're sophisticated, but the most common thing is to chew a twig and cross your fingers. Dental hygiene has more to do with divine mercy than with routine care. Body odor is omnipresent. There is no deodorant, but there are perfumes for those who can afford them. So maybe you put a little myrrh or rose oil on your neck just before walking 8 kilometers in sandals under the Athenian heat. The result was a unique Greek mixture of musk, dust, and despair. Laundry was infrequent. Clothes were washed by hitting them against river stones. If you were poor, your tunic probably hadn't seen water since the last festival. In short, hygiene in ancient Greece is not about looking good or smelling good. It's about looking moderately less disgusting than yesterday. The oil and scraping method helps, but only to a certain extent when you're sweating in a tunic under a sun that is trying to kill you. So yes, ancient Greece gave us democracy, philosophy, and architecture, but we're still waiting for a decent shower. Now that you have scraped with oil to start a new day, it is time to get dressed. And attention, your ancient Greek wardrobe is, at best, minimalist and, at worst, comically impractical. You have 2 options, a chiton or a himation. Both are basically oversized linen rectangles that are wrapped and fastened with a brooch or tied with a belt. They are not custom-made. They do not fit the body. And they certainly weren't designed with windy days in mind. A breeze at the wrong moment, and all your philosophical vision is exposed. Forget about underwear. It doesn't exist, and bras neither. So, unless you're a Spartan woman trained to run and fight, you only have to hope that your pins hold and that no one realizes that your wardrobe moves like a loose curtain. Now let's talk about footwear. If you're lucky, you'll have a pair of leather sandals. If not, you'll go barefoot. And that means a whole day walking on hot stones, earth trodden by goats, and anything that the local market has crushed in the streets. Imagine walking through a frying pan in July while dodging donkey droppings. That is your daily commute to work. Of course, there is no sun protection, no hats, unless you're a farmer or sailor, and there is no sunscreen either because you live in 450 A.C., and science has not yet been invented. The sun of Euboea. It doesn't care how philosophical you are. It will scorch you. At noon, you have burned shoulders, dirty feet, and a linen tunic stuck to your body in 4 places that defy geometry. And don't forget that public nudity is not scandalous in Greek society. You can come across men training naked in the gym, or even politicians giving speeches with togas that barely stand up. Now, if you're rich, your tunic may be dyed, perhaps a soft purple or saffron yellow. But most people wear off-white or brown because dyes are expensive and no one wants to waste a good color on someone who makes a living fixing fishing nets. So you spend the day dressed like a burrito wrapped in a toga, burned by the sun, sweating, and hoping that the pin does not come loose in front of the priestess. And the worst thing is that you have only done half of your tasks. Welcome to ancient Greece, where military service is not a job. It is your civic duty, what is expected of you socially, and sometimes your one-way ticket to a premature death. If you're a free man, especially in Athens or Sparta, congratulations. You are automatically a soldier, whether you like it or not. In adolescence, you are already training with wooden weapons and learning formations in the phalanxes. That famous Greek battle strategy that consists of standing shoulder to shoulder behind large shields and hoping that the guy next door doesn't trip. In Sparta, children begin military training at the age of 7 in the brutal AEG system, a program that turns children into warriors by basically starving them, whipping them, and isolating them until only the toughest remain. In Athens, things are softer but still mandatory. 2 years of training at the end of adolescence, followed by decades of always being available. You can't say, "I'm more of a thinker." Even philosophers like Socrates fought in wars, and not with witty answers, but with real weapons. And there is always a war. Whether it's Sparta against Athens, Athens against Persia, Sparta against literally everyone, or just a neighboring town getting cocky about trade routes. Conflict is a way of life. Peace is just the pause between two invasions. Armor. If you can afford it, you buy a bronze helmet, a breastplate, greaves, a round shield, and a spear. If you can't, well, try not to be on the front line. Leather and fabric do not stop arrows. The worst thing is that you have to buy your own equipment. That's right. Being a soldier is like being Bob. Bring your own bronze. The poorest citizens beg, borrow, or fight with light weapons, which in Greek means they are more likely to die first. And when you're not fighting, you're preparing, training, cleaning weapons, arguing in the assembly about strategy, or rowing in warships for hours as part of the Navy. Because yes, those triremes were not rowed alone. There is no health care for veterans, no pensions, no therapy, just scars, limps, and occasionally a poorly carved tombstone that praises your virtue and courage. If you think a man's life in ancient Greece seems hard, wait until you hear what a woman's life was like. In most of the Greek city-states, especially in Athens, women had less rights than a bunch of decorative urns. You could not vote, you could not hold public office, you could not own land, and you rarely appeared in public without a male companion. In fact, if people saw you out too often, they might whisper that you were a courtesan or, worse, Spartan sympathizer. Let's begin with your daily routine. You get up before dawn to begin the domestic tasks. You do the laundry, you weave, you grind the grain, you go to look for water, you bake bread, you take care of the slaves if there are any in your house, and you raise the children. You're the general manager of the home, but without salary, respect, or free days. Your social life is limited. You don't go to the theater. You don't participate in philosophical debates. You don't go to the gym. That is only for naked men. You are confined mainly to the gymnasium, the women's quarters, and your contact with the outside world consists of taking a look through the latticed windows, the education. If you're lucky, you might learn to read a little, but above all you are taught domestic tasks, not philosophy. That is for the boys. Your job is to marry well, have children, and remain invisible while doing it. The marriage was celebrated at an early age, often in adolescence, with a man who doubled your age and was chosen by your father, who treated you more like a business agreement than a person. Love was optional. Dowries were mandatory. And when you had children, your main value became your uterus. Now, Sparta was the exception. Spartan women were famous for being more liberated. They received education, exercised in public, and could own property. But before envying them too much, remember that their freedom came from an obsession with war and eugenics sponsored by the state. Your main task as a Spartan woman is to give birth to strong warriors or face dishonor. And if your husband dies, you cannot inherit much. You cannot remarry without permission. And your options dwindle faster than your social circle. You're trapped legally, socially, and often physically. So yes, the Greeks adored the powerful goddesses Athena, Artemis, and Hea, but not real women. They were expected to remain silent, at home, and out of sight. Ancient Athens is acclaimed as the cradle of democracy. And yes, that is technically true. But before getting too excited, let's be clear, you probably would not have been able to participate. In fact, most people who lived in Athens were completely excluded from the democratic process. To vote in the Athenian Ecclesia Assembly, you had to be male, son of Athenian parents, and a citizen over 18 years old. That means that women, foreigners called medics, slaves, and children, who constituted almost 90% of the population, had no political voice whatsoever. That is not democracy for the people. That is democracy for a very specific club of tan men in sandals. However, if you met the criteria, you did more than vote. You were expected to participate constantly. The laws were proposed, debated, and approved in large assemblies of thousands of citizens. There were no career politicians. All eligible men were partly legislators, partly members of the jury, and partly overconfident amateurs. You could even be randomly elected to occupy positions of power, such as directing the treasury or being part of a jury, through a lottery system, which sounds exciting until you remember that there were no requirements. Your fishmonger could supervise military logistics one day. Your uncle, who still believes in sea monsters, could judge a murder trial the next day. And if someone became too powerful, too popular, or simply bothered people, they were ostracized. Once a year, citizens could write a name on a broken piece of pottery, an ostracon, and vote to exile that person for 10 years. Without trial or defense, they simply left. You are becoming too well known. And, nevertheless, despite its flaws, the Athenian democracy was revolutionary. It gave a voice to common men. Well, to some common men, and it laid foundations for future political systems. But let's not kid ourselves, it was not fair or inclusive. If you were a woman, you were silenced. If you were a foreign resident paying taxes, you were silenced. If you were a slave who built the Parthenon, you were definitely silenced. If you were a philosopher who asked many questions, they possibly executed you. Democracy was born in ancient Greece. But if you had arrived expecting equal rights and an inclusive policy, they would have escorted you out of the assembly and told you to bring your own ostracon. In ancient Greece, slavery was not only accepted, it was simply assumed. Even modest homes had at least one slave. Not because the family was rich, but because slavery was so ingrained in society that it was considered as normal as sandals and sunburn. The idea that someone could not own another human being was practically unthinkable. The slaves were not of any specific race or ethnicity. They came from conquered lands. Trianos, Chanos, Syrians, and even Greek compatriots from the wrong city-state at the wrong time. Some had been born as slaves. Others were prisoners of war. A few were kidnapped, then sold. It was a thriving, brutal market, and business was always good. If you lived in Athens, it is likely your slave did everything. He cooked your meals, brought water, cleaned your house, took care of your children, carried the shopping, and remained silent during dinner. Some even took care of business matters or managed the home, while the citizen owner relaxed in the symposium, drinking diluted wine and debating abstract concepts like justice. Utter irony. In the silver mines of Lauren, the slaves, including children, worked in appalling conditions, crawling through narrow wells in total darkness, inhaling toxic dust, and dying slowly for a few coins and civic pride. Some slaves had educations. They taught grammar and mathematics, worked as scribes, or even managed bank accounts. But let's not kid ourselves, they were still someone's property. They could be beaten, branded, sold, or killed on a whim and had no legal rights. The few who achieved freedom, called freedmen, were never truly free. They still owed loyalty to their former masters and were denied citizenship. They could not vote, they could not own land, they only had the hope of slightly better tomorrow. And, unlike later slave systems, there was no widespread abolition movement. Philosophers like Aristotle, yes, that Aristotle justified slavery as something natural and necessary. According to him, some people were naturally slaves. Enlightening, isn't it? Ancient Greece gave us ethics, democracy, and philosophy, but all of it was built at the expense of people who were never allowed to speak, vote, or matter. And that is not a mere footnote. It is the foundation. Do you feel unwell in ancient Greece? It's a shame, because unless you lived next to Hippocrates himself, your health plan included some vague herbs, divine intervention, and many illusions. Let's begin with the basics. There are no hospitals as we know them. If you're sick or injured, you stayed at home. Maybe some neighbor knows something about picas. Maybe some relative remembers a prayer to Asclepius, the god of healing. Maybe your local temple has a snake that you can caress for spiritual comfort. That is all. The most famous Greek doctors were actually a mix of herbalists, philosophers, and also gamblers. They believed in the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to them, disease was caused by an imbalance in these fluids. So if you had a fever, too much blood, it was time to drain some. If you coughed, you had too much phlegm, so you tried fasting. If you were melancholic, it was black bile. Perhaps take a walk or look dramatically at the sea. Most treatments relied on trial, error, and garlic. Perhaps they would give you crushed poppy seeds. Good luck with that. Boiled figs, or a compress made of vinegar and something scraped from a goat. Did it work sometimes? Did it hurt? Almost always. Surgery. Rare, terrifying, and usually a last resort. Without anesthesia or antiseptics, even a simple cut could become infected and kill you. The tools included iron knives, bone saws, and prayers. Many prayers. And if you needed something amputated, you better bring a leather strap to bite. Midwives took care of births, which were dangerous even on the best days. Mortality rates for women and babies were tragically high. A complicated birth, a stuck shoulder, a baby coming breech, that's it. If you were rich, you could call a traveling doctor, someone with real parchment and some sophisticated oils. If you were poor, you depended on local knowledge, home remedies, and your own resistance, or you just didn't recover. But hey, at least they believed in rest, clean air, and balanced diets. At least that. Ancient Greek medicine gave us the Hippocratic Oath, but it also gave us treatments like drinking water boiled with cabbage. So yes, healthcare in ancient Greece was mainly herbs, hope, and endurance. In ancient Greece, theater was not just entertainment. It was a civic duty, a religious ritual, and sometimes a contact sport for the soul. Let's start with the good. Theater was free for citizens. Assuming you weren't a woman, slave, or foreigner, in which case, good luck seeing anything. You sat in a huge open-air theater carved into a hillside, like the great theater of Dionysus in Athens, shoulder to shoulder with thousands of sweaty citizens. And there you stayed all day. Seriously, all day. The Dionysia festival lasted from dawn to night, with plays, tragedies, comedies, and satires following one after another. No interruptions, no snacks, and of course, no bathroom breaks, unless you counted the bushes on the hillside. If you were late or misbehaved, not only would you get dirty looks, but you could be fined. The performances themselves were wild. The tragedies were heartbreaking. Murders, madness, wars, gods destroying families for a bad decision made 3 generations ago. You didn't go there to laugh, but to cry in unison. Then came the comedies, which were not exactly light family plays. These plays mocked politicians, philosophers, entire cities, and bodily functions with astonishing precision. Imagine Saturday Night Live in a college debate having a child, dressing it in a giant phallic suit, and sending it on stage. The actors wore towering masks, platform shoes, and exaggerated costumes. They were all men, of course, even in female roles. The chorus sang, danced, and shouted comments like an ancient Greek version of Twitter, only louder and in tunics. And it wasn't a passive spectacle. The public was noisy. It booed, whistled, threw objects, and argued during the performance. The theater was democracy with stage lights. If the play offended you, you let them know. If it moved you, you screamed, cried, and maybe reevaluated your life. At the end of the festival, a jury voted to choose the winning playwright. Imagine spending 3 days crying for some arrested to discover that the prize was taken by a crude comedy with a talking pig god. That is how ancient Greece was. So yes, in the theater you never just watched. You participated and possibly threw olives. You have survived your tragic theatrical marathon of the whole day. Now you wander through the agora, the bustling heart of the city, and you run into a man dressed in a cape, barefoot, who asks strangers, "What is justice?" Welcome to philosophy. It is everywhere, and it is not optional. In ancient Greece, especially in Athens, philosophy was the local sport, and the champions were names that we now associate with world-changing ideas. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. At that time, however, they were just eccentric men who talked a lot and made others feel stupid. Let's take Socrates, for example. This man made a living asking questions that led nowhere and dismantling people's confidence in their own opinions. You could be minding your own business, buying olives, or petting a stray goat, and he would appear. Do you believe in truth? I guess. What is truth? And that's where 3 hours of mental spiral and wanting to move to Sparta began. He never wrote anything. His student Plato did that. But Socrates left an indelible mark, partly because Athens ended up executing him for being too annoying. Officially, it was for corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods. But let's be honest, he probably kept asking questions during dinner. Philosophy was not a cozy academic pastime. It was noisy, confrontational, and strangely athletic. Debates took place in public spaces. They were spontaneous, intense, and often ended with hurt feelings or deep existential crises. Without microphones, just voices, hands, and enough ego to fill the pathin. And if you thought you could just watch, think again. Philosophers loved to attract random passersby. You couldn't pass in front of Plato's academy. It absorbed you. If you said something slightly wrong, you suddenly became the example of the day of an unexamined life. Not even children were safe. Aristotle tutored Alexander the Great, a teenager who later conquered half the known world. Imagine your high school civics teacher handing you a globe and saying, "Go fix this." So yes, philosophy gave us logic, ethics, science, and political theory. But in ancient Greece, it also gave you a headache, an identity crisis, and a 70% chance of being publicly humiliated by a man in sandals. So you have triumphed in ancient Athens. You are eloquent, intelligent, and politically active. People like you, maybe too much. That is your first mistake. Because in Athens, being too popular could cost you being expelled from the city for 10 years. They didn't arrest you or fine you. You just disappeared. It was not about conspiracy or secret agreement. It was part of the system. It was called ostracism. It was perfectly legal, public, and terrifying. Once a year, Athenian citizens met to decide if an ostracism vote would be held. If enough people agreed, everyone wrote the name of the person they wanted to exile on a piece of broken ceramic called an ostracon. If someone obtained 6,000 or more votes, they were banished. Without a trial or explanation. You just had to pack and leave. It was not necessary to be criminal. In fact, most of the ostracized had done nothing wrong, except being too influential. Perhaps you were a war hero, a persuasive speaker, or simply had great hair. Whatever it was, your fellow citizens decided that you were becoming a threat to democracy, and democracy voted to throw you into temporary oblivion. And here's a twist. It was not permanent. Ostracism lasted 10 years, after which you could return as if nothing had happened. Your properties remained intact. You retained your citizenship. No hard feelings. Just a decade-long vacation that you had not asked for. Some famous Athenians were sentenced to ostracism. Aristides that just was so loved that, it is said, someone voted against him only because he was tired of hearing how virtuous he was. Brutal. Even Teucer, the military genius who saved Athens in the Battle of Salamis, was expelled when he became too arrogant. It turns out gratitude has an expiration date. Ostracism aimed to protect Athens from tyrants, but it often punished success. Therefore, if you were ambitious, you had to tread carefully. Be respected, but not too much. Popular, but not charismatic enough to worry people. Think of it as a reality show in which the prize for winning too many fans is being exiled to the countryside with your dignity and your olive oil reserve. Athens gave rise to democracy, but also invented the culture of cancellation 2,500 years earlier than expected. In ancient Greece, you did not wonder if you're going to die young. You only wondered how long it would take to die and if it would be painful. Life expectancy was around 30 or 35 years. And that was if childhood was overcome, which was no small thing. Approximately 1 in 3 children did not survive childhood due to diseases, poor nutrition, and the fact that hygiene was, as we have already mentioned, more theoretical than real. You could die of anything: a scratch that became infected, a fever that no one could explain, childbirth, one of the main causes of death for women, or something as simple as drinking water from a glass in poor condition. Medicine was limited, and divine intervention was not exactly characterized by its consistency. If you live in a city, diseases spread quickly. Overcrowded housing, open sewers, and community fountains made epidemics a common occurrence in daily life. The infamous plague of Athens during the Peloponnesian War wiped out a third of the city. Tacitus wrote about it, then contracted it, and somehow survived. Most were not so lucky. War was constant. If you were a man, you were most likely to die wielding a spear or rowing in a galley. Even if you did not die in combat, the wounds often became fatal days later. There were no antibiotics or sutures, just hope and garlic compresses. And there was always the possibility of dying from a divine whim, displeasing a god, forgetting a sacrifice, mocking a temple statue, or speaking of Zeus after 3 glasses of wine. And you could find yourself on the wrong side of a lightning bolt, a plague, or a spontaneous stampede of goats. The burial rites were important. If your family could not afford a proper funeral with coins for the boatmen and rituals to secure your place in the afterlife, you could end up abandoned outside the city walls, unidentified and forgotten. It was not only tragic, but dangerous from a spiritual point of view. The Greeks believed that unburied souls wandered eternally, trapped between 2 worlds. Death was not poetic. It was every day, and it did not care about your philosophy, beauty, or lineage. You could be a slave, general, or poet and still die from a moldy fig or angry mosquito. The Greeks had 12 gods of Olympus, and none loved you. In theory, the religion of ancient Greece was based on harmony with the divine, on worshiping Zeus, Hea, Athena, Apollo, Artemisa, Poseidon, and the rest of the golden crew of Mount Olympus. In practice, it was constant control of spiritual damage. These gods were not peaceful or loving deities. They were divine drama queens with superpowers. Forget about sacrifices. They would ruin harvests. If you prayed wrong, your ship would sink. If you stepped on the wrong forest, a snake would bite you, or plague or famine would lash you. You chose. The gods not only demanded loyalty, they demanded perfect synchronization, impeccable rituals, and blind obedience. There were no weekly visits to the temple. There were daily rituals, altars at home, seasonal festivals, and civic ceremonies. Before planting, you had to pray to Dida so that there were no wars. You had to offer offerings to Ares, who traveled by sea. It was better to pour some wine to Poseidon and perhaps offer him a goat, just in case. Each god had their favorites and grudges. Apollo could protect your city, unless your grandfather had ever offended him, in which case you were cursed until further notice. Hera was the goddess of marriage, but she also specialized in making the lives of mortal women miserable if Zeus only looked at them. Athena rewarded wisdom and also turned people into spiders. Just like that. And in case the Olympics were not enough to keep you nervous, there were nymphs, satyrs, spirits, river gods, and monsters lurking around every corner. If you stepped on the wrong sacred place, suddenly your left leg belonged to a vengeful forest goblin. But the worst of all was that you never knew why something bad happened. Was it the wrong offering or the wrong time? Had you insulted a god in a dream? Perhaps it was your cousin? Perhaps it was something your great-grandfather had done. It does not matter. The gods act in a mysterious and deeply personal way. And, nevertheless, despite all the terror, Greek religion was interwoven in all aspects of life, from politics to childbirth, passing through the Olympic Games. The gods were feared, yes, but they were also depended upon. Their temples were landmarks of the cities. Their festivals were national holidays. And their myths explained everything from lightning to love. You did not believe in the gods by faith. You believed by survival instinct. So after all, the sun-scorched houses, the barley breakfast, the blisters on the feet from the sandals, the wars, the plagues, the gods, and the traumas related to goats. Let's ask the question bluntly. Would you endure even a single day in ancient Greece? Honestly, no. You'd collapse before lunchtime. The heat, diet, and constant threat of war or divine punishment would erase that toga fantasy worthy of Instagram from your face. You are not used to carrying water before breakfast or doing your business in a hole next to a temple goat. You would miss running water, aspirin, and your right to complain without being exiled with pottery. You may love the idea of living among marble statues, brilliant philosophers, and epic poets. But guess what? Those were 1% of ancient Greece. For everyone else, it was exhausting work, limited rights, and frequent funerals. Your democracy, only if you are a male citizen. Your medicine, garlic and hope. Your gods, often furious. Your social networks? A guy yelling in the agora about justice while waving a fish. And yet, despite all that, the Greeks endured. They built temples that still stand, wrote plays that we still perform, debated ideas that we still struggle with, and laid the foundations for everything from astronomy to ethics. They didn't just survive the hardships. They created civilization while sweating bullets. You wouldn't last, but they would. Not because life was easy, but because they found ways to make sense of a world full of chaos. They questioned everything, fought constantly, wrote beautifully, died young, and yet somehow shaped the modern world. So no, you probably wouldn't survive your first sunstroke, a goat bite, or an unsolicited philosophy lesson on the street. But if you did, if you adapted, endured, and listened carefully, you would find yourself among some of the most passionate, resilient, and brilliantly imperfect people history has ever known. And they wouldn't judge you for your difficulties. They would simply give you a tunic, point you to the amphui, and say, "Good. Now, take it to the hill." It all started with death and betrayal. Prasutagus, king of the tribe of the Iceni in what is now eastern England, had played his cards well with the Romans. For years he had walked a tightrope, ruling as vassal king under the shadow of Rome. He had wealth, autonomy, and peace while remaining useful to the empire. But when he died, around 60 DC, he left a will intended to protect his people. He named the Roman emperor as co-heir alongside his two young daughters, hoping that this gesture of loyalty would guarantee their safety and sovereignty. He was wrong. Rome did not respect the will. Rome did not negotiate. Rome took, without hesitation. The Roman authorities annexed the kingdom of the Iceni without further ado. His soldiers broke in and took everything: land, cattle, homes, and treasures. But the theft of wealth was not the worst crime. It was what they did next that turned a political insult into a personal hell. They whipped Queen Boudica in public, not just to humiliate her, but to send a message. You are nothing. And to top it off, they raped her daughters in front of her. It wasn't just repression. It was a psychological war, of the type intended to break the spirit of a people. But it didn't break Boudica. It forged her. Rome believed it had crushed an unimportant tribal woman under its boot. What it had done was awaken a lion, a queen who would take her pain and turn it into vengeance, a mother whose anger would soon set cities aflame, a woman who would remind Rome that even empires can bleed. News of the atrocity spread quickly throughout Britannia. Other tribes listened closely. They remembered their own humiliations, their own land losses, their own children killed in Roman campaigns. Rome believed that the tribes were divided and dispersed. But at that moment, they shared one thing: the fury of Boudica. What began with the rape of a queen by Rome would soon end with the empire trembling in fear. They had broken a treaty, destroyed a family, and in doing so, had shattered the illusion of Roman invincibility in Britannia. It was more than a mistake. It was the spark that would ignite one of the fiercest revolts Rome had faced. If Rome expected Boudica to sink into silence, it understood her poorly. Boudica had not been born to obey. She had been born to lead them. Roman historians, who rarely praised their enemies, described her as tall, fierce, with a red mane that fell to her waist and a voice that cut through crowds like a war horn. She was not just a queen by birth. She was a symbol now, and now she was a threat. But before becoming that threat, she became something even deeper: a mother who had nothing left to lose. Roman brutality had tried to erase her dignity, the future of her children, and the pride of her people. But Boudicca refused to be a victim. She understood that what Rome feared most was not just an army. It was their unity, and so she began to forge it, tribe after tribe. First, the Trinons tribe. They had once been powerful before Rome crushed them with taxes, land confiscations, and forced labor. When Boudicca spoke, she did not do so as just a diplomat. She spoke as a warrior mother, scarred yet unbreakable. She reminded them of their ancestors, their gods, and the land that no longer belonged to them. Her pain was everyone's pain, her rage everyone's rage. Then the other tribes began listening. The Carel-Talvi, the Coronovi, even some of the Brigantes tribe. Her cause was no longer just revenge. It became a sacred mission to cleanse Britannia of Roman arrogance. She did not promise safety. She promised glory and death with honor, if it came to that. And they followed her lead, because she did not stay behind her warriors then. She rode among them, spear in hand, with her hair loose in the wind and her gaze fixed on the future. She shouted the names of the raped, the enslaved, the executed. She invoked gods like Andres, the Celtic goddess of war, as a witness, and her warriors believed her when she said that the gods would fight with them. She had no formal military training, no scrolls with Roman strategies, but she had something more lethal, a righteous fury, sharpened by betrayal and guided by purpose. And the earth itself seemed to shift under her command. This was more than a rebellion. It was a true resurrection. The queen that Rome believed to have destroyed was now the spearhead of a movement that would soon make the empire tremble. And she was just beginning. The Roman eagle had flown over Britannia for a long time, but now the winds beneath its wings were changing. The fury of Boudicca was not just a forest fire. It was a storm forming with a terrifying purpose. And storms need fuel. That fuel came from thousands of Britons who had waited years, even generations, for someone to challenge the empire. Someone who spoke not in Latin, but with blood and iron. She gave them that voice. Everything began with war councils held under sacred hills and forests illuminated by the moon. Boudicca did not sit on any throne. She stood on the earth beside her people. She listened to the anger of the elders of the tribes, the pain of the mothers, and the chants of the druids who saw omens in the sky. Everyone spoke of the same truth. Rome had gone too far. Now it was time to fight back. The warriors of the Trinovanes brought spears, slings, and ancient battle chants. The Aeni added cavalry, swift riders with disheveled hair and war paints, fierce and brave. Other tribes joined with axes, swords, and torches. Even the women took up arms, inspired by their queen. It was not just the formation of an army. It was the resurrection of Celtic identity. But Rome had trained legions, professional, armored, disciplined, and lethal soldiers. Boudicca had to compensate with numbers, knowledge of the terrain, and something that Rome could never teach. The hatred forged in humiliation. Soon, Boudicca's army grew to tens of thousands. The farmers became warriors. The hunters became murderers. The former Roman slaves and mistreated tribal allies changed sides. They were not soldiers who fought for money. They fought for memory, revenge, and the right to raise their children free of chains. She gave a speech, the first of many. Roman historians would later record her words, albeit with their own bias. But what resonates through time is clear. She swore to win or die. There would be no surrender, no submission, no turning back. Then came the first target, Camulodunum. Formerly a British bastion, now a Roman colony full of temples, statues, and villas. The Temple of Claudius stood as an insult, a sanctuary dedicated to the emperor who had conquered them. For Boudicca and her warriors, it was not sacred. It was a provocation, and it would be the first to fall. The tribes no longer whispered of rebellion. They marched towards it, armed with fury and led by a queen who refused to kneel. Camulodunum had no chance. What was once a proud Roman colony had become a symbol of everything that the people of Boudicca despised. Its streets did not resonate with tribal chants, but with orders in Latin. Its buildings stood on the most sacred ground, and above all stood the Temple of Claudio, a marble mockery built with forced labor, which praised the emperor who had subdued the Britons. For Rome, it was a monument. For Boudicca, it was a target. She gave the order. What followed was not a siege. It was an execution. Her army descended like a tidal wave. The Roman settlers, many of them veterans who had intimidated and taxed the local tribes, were caught by surprise. The city did not have adequate walls. The few Roman soldiers stationed there were ill-prepared, expecting peace, not war. They tried to defend the temple, barricading themselves inside, believing that it could withstand an assault. It was not like that. In 2 days, the forces of Boudicca took it. The streets were stained red. They spared no one. Men, women, and children were massacred. The War of Boudicca was not only military. It was personal. Her warriors destroyed Roman statues, burned villas, and directed their anger against the very symbols of occupation. The temple was set on fire. Its roof collapsed in a storm of fire that lit up the sky for kilometers. The survivors were few, and those who managed to escape told stories of horror that chilled the blood of the Romans. The fury was not random. It was deliberate. It was about people who had seen how their homes were taken from them, their gods were mocked, and their daughters were sold. Now they claimed back with interest what had been stolen from them. Roman officials sent petitions for help to Governor Suetonius, who was hundreds of kilometers away in Wales, suppressing another rebellion. But when he learned of the fall of Camalodunum, it was already ash and smoke, a destroyed colony, its citizens dead, and the flame of rebellion burning more strongly. Boudicca did not stay to celebrate. There was no time. She knew that Rome would respond, and harshly, so she moved on, aware that each victory gave her momentum. Her next destination was a larger, richer, and even more vulnerable city, Londinium. If Rome had not taken her seriously before, now she would. Camalodunum was the beginning, but it was not yet revenge. Not until the beating heart of the empire in Britannia felt the fire. Londinium was the jewel of Roman Britannia. Founded only 17 years before, it had become a thriving commercial and administrative center. Merchants from all over the empire filled its markets. Officials carried out imperial affairs under tiled roofs. Wealth flowed through its streets like water. But as the army of Boudicca approached, that wealth turned to panic. Governor Suonio, who had hurriedly returned from Wales with a small force, arrived just before the rebellion. He looked at Londinium, crowded, extensive, defenseless, and made a brutal decision. He abandoned it. The Roman legions stationed elsewhere were too far away to help. Suonio could not risk his limited troops in a city that could not be defended. So he retreated, taking with him those who could flee. He left behind the old, the sick, the stubborn, and those too slow to believe that an army led by women could bring down Rome. They would soon learn otherwise. The forces of Boudicca swept through Londinium like thunder. There were no walls to climb, no gates to tear down. The city was open and she made it bleed. Her warriors ravaged the streets with the fury of generations. They did not loot. They did not occupy. They eradicated. The slaughter was systematic. Roman citizens were dragged from their homes. Entire families were massacred. Some were impaled. Others burned alive in temples. No quarter was given, and no Roman symbol was spared. The villas were set ablaze. The warehouses exploded in flames. The smoke that rose could be seen kilometers away, coiling black against the British sky. It was not just a massacre. It was a declaration. The message: Rome is not invincible. Contemporary Roman sources, such as Tacitus and Cassiodeion, estimated that tens of thousands died. Some accounts say that the brutality even surpassed what happened in Camalodunum. For the Romans, this was not just a rebellion. It was the apocalypse. And in the middle of all this rode Boudicca. She did not hide behind commanders. She led the charge in her chariot, flanked by her daughters. She contemplated how the empire's pride crumbled before her eyes. It was not about senseless violence. For her, it was justice for what Rome had done. To her family, her people, her land. And it was not over, because before her rose another Roman center, Verilium. And beyond, the total reprisal of Rome. Rome had faced rebellions before. It had fought wars on all continents, but had never seen anything like Boudica. She was not a general trained in tactics. She did not speak Latin. She did not wear polished armor. However, she had reduced 2 Roman cities to ashes and massacred thousands of people, both citizens and soldiers. And now, while Verulamium, a prosperous Romanized city northwest of Londinium, burned, the empire began to panic. News of her rampage reached the Roman Senate. It is said that Emperor Neron himself considered withdrawing completely from Britannia. Imagine that. An empire that stretched from the deserts of Africa to the mountains of Germania considering withdrawal because of a woman with a chariot and a cause. That's how terrified she made them. In reality, Boudica's power did not reside only in her army. It was in what she represented. Rome saw itself as unbreakable, its cities as eternal, its dominion as destiny. But here was a Celtic queen who had been defeated and humiliated, and who was now leading a revolt that had reduced entire Roman settlements to ashes. Each new city she burned was not just a tactical victory. It was a psychological blow. Verulamium suffered the same fate as Camulodunum and Londinium. It was rich, Romanized, and completely unprotected. Boudica's warriors massacred the inhabitants, destroyed the temples, and razed the Roman infrastructures. The archaeological evidence still shows a thick layer of ash under the modern city, a fire that burned with such intensity that it left a scar on earth. But there was a paradox. With each victory, Boudica's war machine grew heavier. His army grew, but supply lines shrank. The organization faltered. Intoxicated by success, some tribes grew careless, and Rome, known for its resistance, regrouped. Governor Suetonius was not idle. He had retreated, yes, but he had not surrendered. He began to gather reinforcements, collecting legions hardened in 1,000 battles from all over the province. He looked for high ground, studied terrain, and prepared for a decisive battle. Even so, even though Rome was regaining strength, fear persisted in the hearts of all soldiers. Could they stop her? Because Boudica was not only waging war. She was rewriting conquest history, and she was demonstrating, city after city in flames, that Rome could bleed and queens could fight back. The final confrontation approached, and the empire held its breath. The fire had spread as much as it could. Now the storm had to face steel. Governor Gas Suetonius Pinus had carefully chosen the battlefield. He was not just any Roman officer. He was a survivor. While Boudica's warriors celebrated victories, Suetonius calculated. He selected a narrow gorge, a small space surrounded by forests and hills, where Boudica's numerical advantage would be of little use. His army was small, perhaps 10,000 men, but they were all trained killers, forged in the legion's discipline. Boudica's forces, on the other hand, were immense. Some sources claim that up to 200,000 warriors marched under her banner. But they were not soldiers. They were farmers, blacksmiths, tribal chiefs, and seekers of freedom. Inspired but undisciplined, armed with fury but without training. They believed that numbers would crush Rome like a tide. They were wrong. As Boudica's army approached, she gave a final speech. Standing atop her war chariot and flanked by her daughters, she reminded them of the suffering of the floggings, rapes, stolen lands, and burned homes. She invoked the goddess Andre, invoked ancestors, and swore victory or death. Her warriors roared in response. They believed that gods would lead them to victory. Then the battle began. The British charged. They filled the field with primal fury, but Suetonius stood firm. He let them approach, crammed into the narrow ground. Then, with perfect timing, he unleashed the Roman counterattack. The spears flew in close formation, shields intertwined. The Roman swords, short and sharp, sank deep into the confused mass. Wave after wave of British crashed against a wall of iron, and each time they broke. Then the Romans advanced step by step, disciplined, precise, ruthless. Behind the British, chariots and families had followed the army, hoping to witness the Roman defeat. Instead, They became a fatal obstacle. The warriors could not retreat. Panic spread. The narrow battlefield became a slaughter. When the dust settled, it was over. Tens of thousands of Britons lay dead. The rebellion was crushed. The empire had bent, but not broken. Boudicca had risked everything against Rome, and, although she lost the battle, the memory of her resistance would resonate stronger than the clash of swords. Her final destiny would remain a mystery, but her legend was already immortal. The battlefield was silent. The roar of war was replaced by moans of the dying. Boudicca had not only lost a battle, but a war she herself unleashed. The ground was soaked with the blood of her people, and the ashes of her dreams scattered in the cold British air. And Boudicca was nowhere to be found. There are no eyewitnesses to her last breath, nor any clear details about her death. Roman historians offer contradictory versions. Some say she took poison, choosing death over capture. Others suggest that she fell ill and died in silence after the battle. But what they all agree on is that she disappeared. No chained queen was paraded through the streets of Rome. There was no public execution or final humiliation. She simply disappeared, like a storm that consumes itself. But in that disappearance, something extraordinary happened. She became something more than a queen. She became a myth. Rome, shocked and humiliated by the magnitude of her rebellion, tried to bury the memory, but it was already too late. Boudicca had become a name whispered in tribal songs and resonated in the sacred forests. For the British, she was not a defeated rebel. She was a martyr, a goddess of war and revenge, a mother who had faced the most powerful empire in the world and made it bleed. Even among the Romans, there was reluctant respect. Tacitus, although Roman to the core, did not paint her as a barbarian, but as a formidable leader harmed by the empire's arrogance. Cassius Dio wrote about her imposing presence and terrifying speeches. They feared her, yes, but they also admired her determination. And throughout the centuries, Boudicca refused to die. She resurfaced in Victorian statues, in poems by Tennyson, in history books, in school lessons. She became a symbol of rebellion, especially for women who saw in her story a fire that could not be extinguished. Her chariot, with spiked wheels that pierced time, became a vehicle of resistance. And so, although her body may be lost to history, her voice has never left. It travels with the wind. It screams in the fire. It resonates in every soul that has faced oppression and whispered, "I will not kneel." Centuries have passed since Boudicca disappeared into the mists of history, but her shadow still lingers in the British Isles. You can see her name engraved on monuments, hear her invoked in political speeches, and feel her presence in the stubborn spirit of a land that never forgot her completely. In London, near the Westminster Bridge, a bronze statue shows her standing on a war chariot, flanked by her daughters, with her gaze fixed on the horizon and the wheels raised as a sign of defiance. At her feet, traffic hums and tourists wander, unaware that they are walking on the echoes of her rebellion. But her legacy is not limited to statues. It is about what she represents. Boudicca became something more than the sum of her battles. She became an eternal question that every empire, every oppressor, every ruler who forgets asks the power of the people. What happens when the silenced rise up? She was not perfect. Her revolt was marked by bloodshed and massacres. Tens of thousands died by the hands of their warriors. But history is not written by saints. It is sculpted by those who dare resist. And resistance, by nature, is rarely clean. Even so, what makes Boudicca endure is not just her war against Roma. It is the fire she lit in human imagination. A woman who lost everything, yet remained standing. A queen who refused definition by the empire that tried to break her. A mother who turned pain into a sword. Modern historians continue to debate her role, her decisions, her motives. But ask any Briton who Boudicca was, and they will not recite footnotes. They will tell you she was the queen who made Roma bleed. The woman who united tribes that had previously clashed with each other. The warrior who taught the world that dignity can arise even from devastation. And with that, she becomes more than a historical figure. She becomes a symbol of rebellion, courage, the unwavering will to be free. Because even when Roma rebuilt cities and redrew maps, it could not erase her. Her flame still burns. In every fight against tyranny, in every voice that dares say no, and in every soul that prefers to die standing than live on its knees, Boudica has disappeared, but her legend endures forever. For the ancients, disease was never random. It was not just bacteria, viruses, or rebellious cells. Those explanations would come thousands of years later. In the ancient world, disease was not a symptom of physical failure, but a deeper disturbance, an alteration of balance, a fracture in the harmony between body, mind, soul, and nature. In Mesopotamia, disease was often considered divine punishment. If someone got sick, it was believed they had offended a god, broken a taboo, or attracted a curse. The diagnosis did not begin with symptoms, but with questions. What have you done? Who have you angered? Priests and healers worked together, interpreting omens, casting spells, and prescribing rituals with herbal treatments. In ancient China, balance acquired a systematic meaning through yin and yang and the five elements. Health was a state of balance between opposing forces. Excess heat or cold, dryness or humidity unbalanced the body. Practitioners of traditional Chinese medicine did not treat just the cough. They asked when it started, what time of day it worsened, what emotions accompanied it. Healing was holistic. Herbs, acupuncture, and diet changes were tools to rebalance the inner cosmos. In Greece, the doctor Hippocrates rejected the idea that gods punished people with diseases. However, he also saw health as harmony. His theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, dominated Western medicine for centuries. Each humor was linked to a temperament and element. The excess or deficiency of one caused physical symptoms and personality changes. It was said, for example, that a melancholic person had excess black bile. In all cultures, a common thread remained. Health meant integrity, not only the absence of pain, but presence of balance. Whether it was the Vedic concept of dashas in India or the belief in spiritual possession in African healing traditions, ancient peoples understood that the human being was not isolated. We were part of nature, and when it was altered, it fought back. So when the ancient healers laid hands on the sick, they were not only looking for physical signs. They listened for imbalance, and they believed that to heal someone, it was necessary to treat the invisible forces with the same care as the visible wounds. In the land of pyramids and pharaohs, medicine was both science and witchcraft. The ancient Egyptian healers, called SWNW, were not just doctors. They were sacred intermediaries between the body and divinity. Their medical practices were surprisingly advanced, yet deeply intertwined with rituals and magic. For the Egyptians, the body could bleed, bruise, or break. But their ailments were never purely physical ones. The spirit, the gods, and even the afterlife played a role in all diseases. Much of what we know comes from medical texts, such as the Ebers Papyrus, which dates from around 1550 AC. This ancient parchment contains hundreds of remedies for everything from toothaches to tumors. Egyptian doctors performed surgeries, healed fractures, treated infections, and drained abscesses with copper tools sterilized by fire. They knew how to take a pulse, how to observe urine and feces for diagnoses, and how to use a wide variety of herbs, many of which are still used today. But no treatment began without the god's blessing. It was believed that Thoth had given humanity the secrets of healing. Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war and plague, was feared and venerated. She could unleash epidemics or grant recovery from them. Spells were often recited over patients as herbs were applied. Words had power. The incantations were not empty phrases. They were medicine in sound form. One of their best tools was honey. It was used as an antiseptic long before bacteria was known. The wounds were bandaged with it, sometimes combined with resin or cotton. Garlic and onion were prescribed for heart health. Castor oil served as a laxative. Even moldy bread was pressed on infected wounds, a primitive antibiotic ahead of its time. Egyptian doctors treated not only commoners, but also royalty. Their skills were respected beyond borders. Neighboring civilizations sought Egyptian doctors for difficult cases. In a way, they were the first specialists. Some focus on the stomach, others on the eyes, or even on spiritual afflictions. But in all their knowledge, there was no separation between the physical and sacred. The fever could come from the Nile's mosquitoes or from an angry ghost. Healing the body meant pleasing the gods, purifying the soul, and restoring divine balance. For the ancient Egyptians, a healer's true role was not only to cure disease. It was to restore cosmic order. Long before modern medicine emerged, India was already writing its own healing history. A story that did not consider the human body as a machine, but as a reflection of the cosmos. This ancient system is known as Ayurveda, a Sanskrit word that means science of life. Rooted in the Vedic tradition, Ayurveda is more than just a medical practice. It is a philosophy, a way of living in harmony with nature, the seasons, and spirit. At the heart of the Ayurveda is the concept of the three dashas, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. Each represents a unique combination of the five elements: earth, water, fire, air, and ether. Vata governs movement. Pitta controls transformation, such as digestion, and Kapha manages structure and stability. We are all born with a unique balance of these dashas. According to Ayurveda, disease arises when this balance is disturbed by poor diet, stress, environment, or lifestyle. Vedic texts, such as the Karaka Samhita and the Sushruta Samhita, date back more than 2,000 years. These detailed manuals offer not only herbal remedies, but also guidance on surgery, obstetrics, psychology, and even ethics for doctors. Charika focused on internal medicine, promoting prevention as the first line of defense. Sushruta, for his part, is remembered as a surgery pioneer, since he described more than 300 surgical procedures and more than 120 surgical instruments, many carved in wood or metal. One of his most surprising techniques was rhinoplasty, which consisted of reconstructing the nose using a skin flap from the patient's cheek or forehead. It was not an aesthetic intervention, but often used to restore mutilated faces as punishment, millennia before Western medicine did. Sushruta had already laid the foundations. But the strength of Ayurveda lies in its holistic approach. Healing the body is inseparable from healing the mind and soul. Treatments include herbal medicine, yoga, breathing exercises, pranayama, oil massages, abhyanga, and meditative fasting. Plants such as turmeric, ashwagandha, neem, and tulsi were not just food. They were medicines, purifiers, and protectors of the life force. An Ayurvedic healer could treat fever not only with herbs, but also by adjusting the sleep schedule, examining emotional health, and cleansing the digestive fire or agni. Ayurveda teaches that you are not separate from nature. You are nature. And when you get sick, it is nature that calls you to regain balance. In ancient China, health was never reduced to flesh and bones. It was about energy. The invisible life force called qi, pronounced qi, flowed through all living beings. And the key to well-being was to ensure that the qi moved freely, without blockages or excesses. This fundamental idea would shape one of the oldest medical systems in the world, traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM. To understand disease, the ancient Chinese doctors had to first understand nature itself. They observed the rhythms of the seasons, the phases of the moon, the behavior of animals, and the movements of the cosmos. From these patterns emerged two fundamental principles, yin and yang, and the five elements, wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. Yin and yang represented balance in all things. Yin was cold, dark, passive, internal. Yang was hot, bright, active, external. Each organ, emotion, and function of the body was classified according to these opposing but complementary forces. Health was then a dynamic balance between them. Fever was not just an increase in temperature. It was an excess of yang. Fatigue could indicate a depletion of yin. Diagnosis was an art. Doctors did not rely on tools. They relied on the senses. They examined the tongue, took the pulse in multiple positions, listened to the tone of voice, and asked questions about dreams, emotions, and bowel movements. Each detail offered information about the balance or imbalance of qi. To restore health, they resorted to a wide set of tools. Acupuncture, the insertion of fine needles into precise points along the body's meridians, was used to unblock the qi and restore its flow. Moxibustion, which consists of burning the artemisia herb near these points, was used to heat and stimulate circulation. Cupping, herbal formulas, qigong exercises, and strict dietary adjustments played a fundamental role. The ancient text Huangdi Neijing, or the internal canon of the Yellow Emperor, compiled about 2,000 years ago, remains the basis of today's traditional Chinese medicine. It was not limited to listing diseases. It explored the causes, prevention, and lifestyle. It taught that emotions such as anger, pain, and fear could alter the organs, and that healing required emotional balance in addition to physical remedies. Chinese medicine never separated the person from the world around them. To treat the body, you have to treat the climate, the soul, and the invisible energy within it. The ancients believed that, in every heartbeat, the qi spoke, and the healer's task was to listen. In the temples of ancient Greece and in the forums of Rome, medicine began to move away from the divine and into the realm of reason. But even here, the body was still considered a delicate ecosystem governed by balance and temperament. And at the center of this worldview was a theory that would shape Western medicine for more than 1,000 years. The four humors developed by the Greek physician Hippocrates and later expanded by Roman physicians such as Galen. The theory proposed that the human body was governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor corresponded to an element: air, water, fire, and earth, and to a specific temperament. A healthy person had these fluids in balance. Disease was simply the result of an excess or deficit of one of them. If someone had a fever and was aggressive, they could have an excess of yellow bile, a caloric imbalance. A pale and apathetic patient could suffer from an excess of phlegm related to cold and humidity. Therefore, treatment focused on restoring balance through bloodlettings, purges, special diets, and baths. But the Greeks were not limited to the humors. They also believed in the healing power of observation and environment. The Hippocratic Oath, which still resonates in modern medicine, urged doctors not to harm, to carefully observe their patients, and to treat the person as a whole, not just the disease. Hippocrates advised his students to take into account the seasons, the winds, the water quality, and even the mood of the patients. The healing sanctuaries, known as Asclepios, in honor of the god Asclepius, dotted the Greek landscape. They were more than just hospitals. They were spiritual retreats. Patients slept in sacred dormitories, hoping to have healing dreams. Ritual, purification, exercise, diet, and prayer were part of the cure. It was a space where reason and religion walked together. In Rome, medical practice evolved even further with the rise of Galen, a Greek doctor who attended gladiators and emperors. He performed dissections on animals to understand anatomy, wrote hundreds of medical texts, and helped standardize humorism throughout the empire. Although some of his ideas were wrong, Galen's influence lasted centuries. Greco-Roman medicine, despite its mystical origins, began to promote a new idea: that the human body was a complex system, yes, but knowable, and that if understood correctly, it could return to harmony, not only through the gods, but also through reason, rituals, and the careful art of healing. Long before written texts and formal schools of medicine existed, indigenous peoples around the world healed their communities using a deeper kind of knowledge transmitted through stories, visions, and practical experience with the natural world. For these cultures, medicine was not just a profession. It was a way of life interwoven into daily rituals, seasonal rhythms, and sacred ceremonies. Among Native American tribes, healers were known as medicine men or women, but their role went far beyond just physical treatment. They were spiritual guides, storytellers, counselors, and guardians of ancestral knowledge. Disease was considered an alteration in the person's relationship with nature, with the tribe, with the spirits, or with oneself. Healing required more than just herbs. It required reconnecting. Plants were fundamental to this practice. From the Cherokee to the Lakota, each tribe possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the land. What root to chew for pain, what leaf to prepare for fever, what bark to crush for wounds. Sage, cedar, sweet grass, and tobacco were sacred and used in purification rituals to cleanse the body and the spirit. However, medicine was never reduced to just ingredients. It also had to do with intention, ceremony, and respect. Healers often worked in collaboration with spiritual forces. They performed sweat lodges, vision quests, and drum circles. Disease could be caused by a breach of taboos, a spiritual possession, or even soul loss, a condition in which part of the individual's essence had fled due to trauma. In such cases, rituals such as soul retrieval were performed, in which the spirit was called upon through chants, dances, or guided trances. The same deep reverence for nature is observed in indigenous traditions around the world. In the Amazon rainforest, shamans turn to powerful medicinal plants such as ayahuasca, a hallucinogenic drink that is not used for recreational purposes, but to gain healing knowledge. They believe that the plants themselves are teachers who reveal the roots of suffering through visions. In Aboriginal Australia, bush medicine includes herbs, clays, and rituals passed down through Dreamtime, the ancestral era that still guides indigenous identity. Here, healing consists of the balance between the body, the earth, the ancestors, and the songlines. These systems have never been written down. They lived in the songs, the dances, and landscapes of the people. For indigenous healers, modern medicine may have its machines and laboratories, but the earth has always been the first pharmacy. And healing is not about defeating disease. It is about remembering who we truly are. In all ancient civilizations, regardless of language, geography, or belief system, there was one constant: the conviction that healing required more than just herbs and surgery. It required spirit. Whether the disease was considered a divine punishment, an imbalance of the soul, or a rupture with the sacred forces, the ancient peoples believed that true healing began in the invisible world, and ritual was the gateway to that world. In Mesopotamia, long before formal medicine, people turned to priests and exorcists to combat disease. It was believed that diseases were caused by offended gods or malevolent spirits. Clay tablets revealed detailed healing rituals where chants were whispered as remedies were applied. Special figurines were buried under houses to keep diseases away. Rituals were not separate from treatment. They were the treatment. In ancient Egypt, no doctor worked without invoking gods. Before applying honey to a wound or bandaging a limb, the healer used to recite prayers to the god of wisdom or Sekhmet, goddess of healing and wrath. Disease was not just a physical attack. It was a cosmic imbalance. Healing meant realigning the patient with Ma'at, the principle of truth, order, and harmony. In many African traditions, healers called sangomas or gangas used drums, dances, and divination to heal and diagnose. They spoke with the ancestors, invoked the spirits, and often entered trance states to travel to the spiritual realm on behalf of their patients. Herbs were important, but the invisible world was always consulted first. Even in classical Greece, rituals played a key role. In the sacred temples of Asclepius, patients underwent rituals of purification, prayer, and fasting. At night, they slept in encoemesis, dreaming under statues of Asclepius, the god of healing. These dreams were interpreted by the priests of the temple to guide the treatment. Ritual was not superstition. It was structure. It gave shape to suffering, language to pain, and the feeling the disease made sense. Through symbolic acts, people could transform fear to hope, isolation to connection, and chaos to control. And more than that, it reminded them that they were not alone. Even today, science studies the placebo effect, the power of belief, and the healing impact of intention. The ancients did not need data. They already understood it. Sometimes, A word said with reverence can heal more deeply than any sword can. Because not all wounds are visible, and not all medicines are made of matter. When we think of ancient surgery, we often imagine rudimentary tools, trembling hands, and excruciating pain. But the truth is far more impressive and human. Throughout the ancient world, surgery was practiced with surprising precision. These early healers had no anesthesia, antiseptics, or x-rays. But they had skill, courage, and an extraordinary knowledge of the body acquired over generations of observation, trial, and often brutal necessity. In India, the Sushruta Samhita, written more than 2,000 years ago, detailed over 300 surgical procedures. Its author, Sushruta, is considered surgery's father. He described techniques for removing tumors, fixing bones, repairing hernias, and even reconstructing noses, a form of plastic surgery. His tools were sharp, varied, and carefully classified. Tweezers, scalpels, probes, and needles, many of them made of iron or stone. Sushruta emphasized hygiene, surgical preparation, and the importance of understanding anatomy through dissection. Although this was often limited to animals, his surgical wisdom extended far beyond India, influencing Western and Islamic practices centuries later. In ancient Egypt, surgical knowledge was combined with rituals. Papyrus texts reveal procedures for suturing wounds, treating dislocated limbs, and draining abscesses. Tools like bronze knives, bone spatulas, and cauterizing rods have been found in tombs. They even practiced trepanation, which consists of making holes in the skull to relieve pressure or treat head injuries. Surprisingly, many skulls show signs of healing, meaning that the patient survived. Trepanation was not only limited to Egypt. In pre-Columbian Peru, archaeologists discovered hundreds of trepanned skulls, often from warriors wounded during battle. Some surgeries proved surprisingly successful. In some regions, more than 80% of patients survived thanks to bone regeneration. These early surgeons may have used cocoa leaves or fermented corned beer to relieve pain, along with herbal antiseptics. In the Greco-Roman world, Galen advanced surgical techniques by studying gladiators and dissecting animals. His knowledge of the nervous system and vascular pathways laid the foundation for later anatomy. Roman military surgeons effectively treated wounds on the battlefield using artery forceps and ligatures. Although surgery was always dangerous, it was also respected. It was the domain of those brave enough to cut into life itself, hoping to extract health from pain. They were not mere butchers. They were artists with the scalpel. And although their knowledge was incomplete, their legacy endures every time a scalpel is raised for healing, not to harm. Today, we live in a world of digital diagnostics, robotic surgeries, and genetic maps. We can scan a body in seconds and send prescriptions across the ocean with one click. And yet, in the quiet corners of modern medicine, the whispers of the ancient world still resonate. You can find Ayurveda in yoga studios, Chinese herbal formulas in pharmacy aisles, and indigenous smoke purification ceremonies in hospitals to honor traditions. Medical students still take a version of the Hippocratic Oath, pledging to do no harm, just as their Greco-Roman predecessors did. In operating rooms, we use precision tools whose lineage dates back to Sushruda's iron instruments. Concepts such as holistic care, preventive medicine, and the connection between mind and body, now cornerstones of integral health, have roots in the wisdom of ancient civilizations that saw healing not as a task, but as a relationship. Even modern science has come full circle. Research increasingly confirms what the ancients believed, that stress, isolation, and emotional trauma can weaken the immune system, disrupt sleep, and cause physical pain. Meditation, once a spiritual discipline, is now studied for its effects on brain health. Forest bathing, derived from Shinto and indigenous practices in nature, is prescribed for anxiety. And the placebo effect, healing driven by belief, continues to baffle researchers who once dismissed it. It is easy to consider ancient medicine as something obsolete. Superstition, folklore, primitive conjectures. But when we look closer, we see something profound. a vision of the world that treated disease not only as a broken machine, but as an alteration of being, a sign that something somewhere was out of harmony. And that idea is still important because medicine is not limited to treatment alone. It is about meaning, about comfort, about being seen and understood. The ancients knew it instinctively. Whether using chants, needles, leaves, or blades, they understood that healing was something sacred. Today, as we move towards the future of biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and personalized medicine, perhaps we are not leaving the ancient world behind. Perhaps we are returning to it with new tools, but with the same human heart. A heart that continues to yearn for balance, wholeness, healing, not only of the body, but also of the spirit. Her name floats in history like a half-forgotten melody. Sappho, a poet from the island of Lesbos, born around the year 630 A.C., whose voice once moved the hearts of listeners under starry skies, and whose words, even in fragments, still resonate with nostalgia. Unlike the great warriors and kings of ancient Greece, Sappho's fame did not come from conquest, but from emotion. Her domain was not the battlefield, but the human soul. She wrote about love and jealousy, beauty and despair, joy and longing. She captured fleeting moments, a glance, a blush, a tremor, and preserved them in verses like pressed flowers, fragile but eternal. Very little is known about her life. There are no portraits or diaries. What we have are traces, a few lines preserved by ancient scholars, quotes embedded in other works, and the ruins of papyrus scrolls lost in time. And yet, these fragments shine. The Greek philosopher Plato called her the 10th muse. Centuries later, poets, translators, and dreamers would seek her out, reconstructing her life as an unfinished song. Sappho probably was born into a noble family of Lesbos, an island of the northeastern Aegean Sea. This was a place of music and learning where poetry was interwoven into the fabric of social life. It is possible that she had siblings, a daughter, and even political enemies, although the records are vague. She lived through exile and agitation, moments of silence and moments of song. Her world was one in which most women's voices were confined to the home or repressed completely. But Sappho defied the silence. She distinguished herself, not for her rebellion, but for her beauty. She wrote in Aeolic dialect, with short and vivid verses, thought to be sung to the lover. Her style was intimate and rich in images. Evening star, you bring back everything that the bright day has scattered. Words like these have survived empires. And then, as silently as she appeared in the records, she faded away. Much of her work has been lost, burned, buried, or discarded. But what remains demonstrates one thing. She did not need monuments. Her poems were her monument. And today, when we speak of passion in verse, of love without shame, of a longing that defies the centuries, we continue whispering the name of Sappho. To understand Sappho, it is first necessary to understand Lesbos, the island that cradled her voice. Lesbos was not a remote place. In the ancient Greek world, it was a flourishing center of art, music, and philosophy. With its fertile valleys, olive groves, and coastal winds perfumed with salt and flowers, Lesbos was as much a physical paradise as a cultural jewel. It was not Athens. It did not need to be. It had its own rhythm, slower, more sensual, and steeped in lyrical tradition. Here, music was not decoration. It was devotion. The lute and the lyre resonated in the homes and the temples. Poetry was sung, not read. And in this world of sound and nature, the voice of Sappho was born. She lived in the city of Mytilene, the bustling heart of the island. Here politics prospered, as did art. The island had poets and philosophers, rival factions, and changing alliances. Sappho herself was exiled on one occasion, perhaps to Sicily, in the midst of political instability. But it was always Lesbos that drew her back home. It was her muse. Lesbos was also a space of female community uncommon in the ancient world. Aristocratic girls received musical, poetic, and ritual education. Some scholars believe that Sappho directed a kind of thyasos, a circle or school where young women learned the art of lyrical poetry, dance, and devotion to the goddess Aphrodite. It was not a formal education as we know it, but a creative and sacred sisterhood. Their emotional, intellectual, and possibly romantic bonds were forged. Sappho wrote directly to these women, not as abstract muses, but as real presences in her life. She addressed them by name, lamented their departure, celebrated their beauty, and confessed her love to them with a searing honesty. In a fragment, she writes, "I have not received a single word from her. I beg you, bring her back to me." These lines do not come from a myth nor from a theater. They come from a real world, from a circle of women who sang in the light of a lamp, weaving emotions into songs. And although time would later distort her legacy, framing it in scandal or speculation, Lesbos was the soil in which her truth grew, not only a place on the map, but a cultural cradle of passion, art, and female expression. Sappho not only lived in Lesbos, she became Lesbos, her breath, her heart, her voice. In an era when the great epics of Homer praised gods and heroes, and men filled parchments with battles and conquests, Sappho wrote about the heart. She did not sing of war. She sang of a trembling hand, a shy look, a voice that made her body tremble. She was among the first poetesses in Western history to write in the first person. She did not limit herself to narrating events, but felt them. And what she felt was love, longing, jealousy, tenderness, and desire. The most surprising thing of all is that she wrote as a woman for women about women. In ancient Greece, the voice of women was confined to the home or silenced completely. Public life, literature, politics, philosophy, all of that was a matter for men. But Sappho left those walls, not with rebellion, but with rhythm. Her poetry did not demand space. She created it, a private universe where emotion was not weakness, but power. And within that space, she did something radical. She named the women she loved. She did not reduce them to symbols. She did not limit herself to speaking in metaphors. She remembered their laughter, their perfume, the way they braided their hair. In one fragment, she describes the sensation of seeing a loved one. He is equal to the gods. That man who sits next to you, who listens to your sweet voice and observes your charming laughter. Oh, it makes my heart beat fast. Here, Sappho is the spectator, observing the woman she adores talking to another. Her jealousy is silent, painful, deeply human. In just a few lines, she captures all the weight of unrequited love, something that all listeners then and now can understand. Her words had eroticism, but never vulgarity. She wrote about sensuality with the care of a painter, the curve of a neck, the softness of sleep, the way the moonlight touched the skin. She did not separate beauty from intimacy. They were one thing. For that reason, in later centuries, she was often misinterpreted or censored. Some tried to erase her homosexuality. Others mythologized her heartbreak, turning it into tragedy. But none of that detract from the truth of her voice. A woman who wrote with honesty, lyricism, and courage about love, not in theory, but as someone who had lived it deeply, openly, and unapologetically. Sappho not only wrote poetry, she composed music for the soul. Her verses were never meant to be read in silence. In ancient Greece, poetry was alive. It was sound, breath, vibration. The form for Sappho was the lyric, brief and intensely personal, intended to be performed with a lyre, a small stringed instrument that was held in the lap and played gently while the voice carried the words like a breeze over the sea. This was the heart of lyric poetry, and that is where the word lyric comes from. Poetry was not epic. It did not tell long stories of wars and gods. It was intimate, emotional, and immediate. The lyric was a whisper, a confession, a love letter sung under the fig trees or in rooms lit with candles. And Sappho was its undisputed teacher. Her poems were written in Aeolian Greek, a regional dialect rich in smoothness and rhythm. Her preferred meter, now called sapphic stanza, flowed with a particular rhythm. 3 long verses followed by a shorter and more forceful one, like a sigh at the end of a longing thought. It was subtle and musical, like the rise and fall of breathing during a moment of tranquility between lovers. She would have interpreted these songs among women, students, companions, perhaps even priestesses. These meetings, possibly ritual or educational, were also spaces of freedom, spaces where emotion, song, and body were not fragmented, but formed a whole. Through these representations, Sappho taught others the art of composition, creating not only poems, but an entire culture. We can only imagine how it sounded. The soft tinkling of the strings, the clear ascent of her voice, the stillness of the listeners, awaiting each syllable. Many of her poems do not begin with affirmations, but with questions or invocations, like the start of a conversation or a prayer. Come now to me, Aphrodite of golden throne, and free me from harsh worry. They were poems that reached the gods and inner desire, and yet they are surprisingly modern. They could be set to music today and would still awaken something raw and real. Sappho turned poetry into song, and in doing so, she reminded the world that emotion is music, that every pain, every emotion when touched, or every tremor of voice deserves a melody. And hers continues to resonate centuries later. For every line of Sappho's poetry that we preserve today, dozens, maybe hundreds have been lost. What remains are fragments of emotion and sound, phrases torn from their original songs, which float adrift in time. Some are complete stanzas, others are mere whispers, a single word, a hint of nostalgia, a final thought without beginning. And yet, even these broken pieces beat with life, like embers that glow in the ashes of something that once was bright. Why did so much disappear? Time, war, and deliberate destruction. The works of Sappho were collected in 9 volumes, organized in the famous Library of Alexandria. They were probably copied and recited throughout the classical world. But with the fall of that library, much ancient literature was lost. Later, with the rise of Christian influence, many works considered pagan or immoral were suppressed, neglected, or intentionally burned. Sappho's poetry, full of passion, especially for love between people of the same sex, made her an easy target. In the Middle Ages, she became a ghost. Her name survived, but her voice was practically silenced. Only thanks to quotes from other authors preserving grammars, commentaries, or philosophical works did some fragments of her poetry escape extinction. These fragments were often cited for their style or vocabulary, not for their emotional strength. However, the feelings continued to permeate the pages. Then came the papyri. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists excavating in the sands of Oxyrhynchus in Egypt discovered thousands of fragments of ancient manuscripts, including broken and faded lines of Sappho, fragments of songs that had not been seen in more than 1,000 years. This finding was followed by others. In 2004, an almost complete poem was found on papyrus that wrapped a mummy in Germany. Each recovery was like a resurrection, and yet there is still much to discover. Today we read her in echoes. What we long for is not only what she wrote, but what she could have said if history had let her speak without interruption. Even so, there is something unsettlingly appropriate in this survival through fragments. Sappho wrote about impermanence, about fleeting moments, about beauty that slips through fingers like sand. Therefore, perhaps it is appropriate that her poetry reaches us not as a monument, but as a mystery, a puzzle reconstructed by lovers of language, of music, of the heart. A voice that was once drowned in fire and continues to burn. Sappho's poetry was too honest to escape judgment. In life, she was admired and even celebrated as a teacher of lyric poetry. Plato called her the 10th muse, placing her among the divine. However, with the passage of centuries and cultural changes, her legacy was distorted, silenced, or scandalized, depending on the era. Why? Because she wrote about love and not the kind that history felt comfortable remembering. Much of her poetry focuses on deep affection and desire for women. She praised their beauty, lamented their absence, confessed her jealousy, and celebrated their intimacy. In her world, this was not strange. In the cultural environment of Lesbos, especially among aristocratic women, close and possibly romantic emotional bonds were accepted, even honored. But later generations, especially under Roman, Christian, and Victorian values, had difficulty accepting it. Instead of facing their truth, they rewrote history. Medieval scribes ignored her. Renaissance translators softened her language. The Victorians branded her as tragically romantic, heartbroken by a man, and even invented the myth that she threw herself into the void from a cliff for love of a boatman named Fionn, a story that does not appear anywhere in her authentic work. This invented story served to erase her homosexuality, to make her pain more acceptable and her desires more conventional. Some critics reduced her poetry to something merely educational or platonic. Others branded her as indecent, but she persisted. Even in the midst of the scandal, the name of Sappho survived. In the 19th century, when openly speaking about love between people of the same sex was still taboo, her legacy quietly became a coded symbol of queer identity. The words sapphic and lesbian came to designate romantic love between women, originating directly in her name and her home. Unintentionally, she became a figure of resistance, a poetic ancestor of those whose loves were silenced. And even today, the debates continue to resonate. Who was she? A teacher, a lover, a myth, a threat? But perhaps the best question is, why do we continue to fear her truth? Sappho did not write to fit into categories. She wrote what she felt. She named beauty, confessed her longing, and lived through poetry. Her scandal was not in her actions. It was in her honesty. She dared to write about desire, and that is why history tried to silence her voice, but it never could. If there was a divine presence that loomed over the life and work of Sappho, that was Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and irresistible desire. For Sappho, Aphrodite was not just a myth. She was a muse, a confidant, even a kind of companion in moments of passion and heartbreak. Many of Sappho's most powerful verses are not just about love. They are prayers to Aphrodite, invocations, supplications, arguments expressed in verse when the weight of longing became unbearable. In her most famous surviving poem, Ode to Aphrodite, Sappho does not limit herself to praising the goddess. She speaks to her directly, almost like a friend who has heard this pain before. Come me now. If you have ever answered my voice in the past, free me from harsh worry. Fulfill everything my heart longs to achieve. There is no shame in this vulnerability. There is no fear in expressing desire. Sappho's love is never portrayed as sinful or weak. It is divine, something sacred enough to bring a goddess down from the heavens. In the ancient world, Aphrodite was not only concerned with romance. She ruled attraction, seduction, the chemistry between bodies, the pain of separation. Invoking her was recognizing that love could hurt as much as excite. Sappho captured that duality perfectly. She did not idealize love. She lived within its contradictions. She wrote about its sweetness and its sting, its beauty and its cruelty. In another poem, she writes, "Love shook my soul like the wind in the mountain, shaking the oaks." Here, love is not gentle. It is violent, elemental, something that tears at the self without asking permission. By placing Aphrodite at the center of her emotional world, Sappho elevated longing to something mythical. Her poems blurred the line between the personal and the divine, between everyday emotions and cosmic force. And in doing so, she helped build a literary legacy in which love was not just a theme. It was a kind of cult. For Sappho, Aphrodite was not an abstract deity. It was a mirror, a force reflecting all the intensity, confusion, and beauty of the human heart. And in each verse of Sappho, the goddess of love listens and responds. Like her poetry, Sappho's death is a mystery wrapped in myth. Nobody knows exactly when she died, how old she was, or even where she spent her last years. Some say that she died peacefully in Lesbos, surrounded by the sea and the songs that she loved. Others, especially later Roman poets, invented tragic fables, in which it was said that she threw herself to her death from the white cliffs of Lefkada, with her heart broken by an unrequited love towards the handsome boatman Fionn. But there is no historical evidence to support this story. It seems rather an invention, a form of literary tradition dominated by men, of reformulating her love and her suffering in a heterosexual tragedy. It turned the powerful poetic voice of a woman who loved women into a victim of unrequited love for a man. A perfect ending, perhaps, but false. The truth is simpler and deeper. Sappho disappeared as silently as she arrived. After her death, her work lasted for centuries. It was studied by philosophers, cited by playwrights, and sung in performances throughout the ancient Greek world. Her poetry was preserved in 9 books, a treasure of lyrical verses. For a time, her fame rivaled Homer's. But history is not benevolent to the voices that challenge its norms. With the rise of the Roman Empire and, later, the dominance of Christian moral codes, Sappho's openly emotional and sensual poems, especially those that celebrated female love, fell into disgrace. Her writings stopped being copied. Her volumes were abandoned in libraries that would end up burning or collapsing. Some believe that her works were intentionally destroyed by early church officials, who considered her songs dangerous. In the Middle Ages, her name remained, but her words had mostly disappeared. More than 1,000 years would pass before fragments of her verses reappeared, unearthed from Egyptian garbage heaps or cited in ancient grammars. Little by little, she was reborn, not through myth, but through survival. Her death may have been lost to time, but her disappearance was never total. She remained in whispers, in stolen verses scribbled in the margins, in the persistent pain of voices that refused to be forgotten. Sappho did not need a heroic death. Her poems were already immortal, and in the gaps where her words once lived, we can still feel the shape of her spirit, longing, unfinished but never really gone. The life of Sappho may have been lost in the shadows, her verses scattered and incomplete, but her influence has never diminished. If anything, it has only strengthened, like a candle that flickers but refuses to go out. In all eras, someone has rediscovered her. In the Renaissance, scholars immersed themselves in her fragments, marveling at her delicate mastery of emotions. In the Romantic era, poets like Byron and Shelley invoked her name. In the 19th and 20th centuries, when debates about gender and identity began to revive, Sappho became a symbol of queer resilience, female art, and emotional freedom. Her name lives on in language itself. Sapphic is used to describe romantic love between women. Lesbian, taken from the island where she was born, is now a global identity. These words are not just terms. They are echoes of her life, proof that a voice can resonate across millennia and continue to reshape our understanding of love and expression. Artists, writers, and musicians continue to feel attracted to her. Painters have imagined her with a lyre bathed in moonlight. Poets have translated her again and again, searching in each version for the pulse that beats under the words. Modern authors have reimagined, reclaimed, and resurrected her in novels, songs, and plays. And despite everything, one thing remains clear. Sappho speaks to something universal. It doesn't matter that her poems are incomplete. It doesn't matter that her biography is confusing. What matters is emotion burning under the words. The trembling joy of desire, pain of separation, beauty's sacredness. They're feelings we all carry inside. She simply found a way to sing of them. Perhaps that's her true immortality. Not the marble statues nor the footnotes of the scholars, but the way in which a few lines from more than 2,000 years ago can still make someone stop, breathe, and feel less alone. Sappho's gift was never just poetry. It was her presence. She turned feelings to art. She made longing into truth. And in doing so, she became more than a poet. She became a mirror for anyone who has loved deeply, in silence or defying the world. And as long as human hearts break and heal through language, Sappho will exist. Not only remembered, but felt.